Political Poison, Book 2, Paul Turner Mystery. Author, Mark Richard Zubro, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1993. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 2. Both cops stood silently, just inside the doorway. The room smelled of old books and vomit. Turner blocked the smell from his mind. He'd sensed worse at more horrific scenes from long practice. They let their eyes examine everything in the room first. One of the truisms of cop lore is that the murderer always leaves a sign of his presence. As screwed up as this crime scene obviously was, they needed to note every detail they saw. "Trouble fuck," Fenwick said. Turner knew that Fenwick's expletive was the highest rating anyone or anything could get in his partner's classification system. Usually, Fenwick reserved this sacred category for inept Bears quarterbacks when they threw game-losing interceptions, or Cubs pitchers who walked in winning runs. The system proceeded through 3 levels of shit to the highest fuck category. This crime scene certainly rated the most negative classification. Turner and Fenwick pulled out pens and began making notes, starting with the time of the call, the unit numbers of the cops, and the time of their arrival. Turner did a quick sketch of the outer office and the perspective of the body. He'd have pictures of all this later, but he wanted his own memories. He noted items on the desk, walls, and floor. Finally finished, he slowly walked toward the corpse. He seethed with anger as he did this. One thing a detective hates is a contaminated crime scene. This one looked like a herd of buffaloes had been through it. You got your feel for a crime from what you saw, and what Turner saw wasn't the crime, but the aftermath of well-intentioned people trying to help. His anger cooled when he realized the horror they must have gone through, trying to save the dying man. As Turner approached the corpse, he was barely aware of the process. His mind whirled through, asking the myriad of questions that viewing of hundreds of crime scenes had ingrained on his mind. Why did the person die here? How? He was already drawing his picture of this room. No blood trail from the doorway. He stared at the body, searching for meaning and sense. Jewelry still on, pockets not turned inside out. The room was strewn with papers. Careful not to disturb any of them, Turner eased around the room. Where was the body before the rescuers got there? Did the killer come back as part of that group? Did the murderer leave glaring mistakes behind? In more than 90% of the cases, this was the saving grace for the cop. The killer's tendency toward making a dumb mistake. Turner spent 15 minutes filling his notebook with observations and details. A blue cup in back of the desk contained the dregs of a vile, smelling greenish liquid. An electronic juicer on the table near the door had remnants of a similar fluid. The trash can proved to be the source of the vile odors. Vomit-flecked tissues, remnants of the frantic efforts to help the dying man, half filled the receptacle. Turner would keep his notes. The schematic drawing Fenwick was working on would be for the official file. Turner gazed at the body. Giles hardly looked to be at rest. The body was on its back, muscles rigid in convulsion, the eyes wide open, and an extreme facial grimace. He touched the body. Rigor already set in. Fred Nakasinski, the bearded dwarf who took crime scene pictures, stood in the doorway holding his Canon AI-1s. "Ready for pictures?" he asked. "Start in the outer room," Turner said. "Make sure you get the positions of all the papers there and in here." Fred jerked his thumb over his shoulders. "You got visitors?" "What the hell?" Fenwick said. He looked through the doorway. He saw the case sergeant, the commander of the local police district, and a cop from the superintendent's office. He recognized, but whose name he didn't remember. "Nuts," Turner muttered. He and Fenwick hurried to the door of the outer office as detective in charge of the crime scene. Turner knew that technically he had more power than any cop in the city in these few square feet. That didn't stop the brass in a case like this from trying to trample over every square inch of territory. Fenwick planted his large bulk in front of the mass of brass, and said, "I'll give you what you need." Turner turned on his heel and returned to the body. He found Fred Nakasinski on top of a nicked-up wooden chair, focusing his camera down on the body. Sam Franklin, head of the crime lab unit, entered the room. His sharp eyes took in the scene, barely glancing at the body. He snorted in derision. "Stupid politicians will go off like demented fire alarms over this." Turner nodded. "You ready for us?" Franklin asked. Turner scanned the room carefully. "I want to examine the papers. That'll take a while. I'll handle them as little as possible. And send them along." Franklin directed his minions in their tasks. Dusty for fingerprints, vacuuming the floor, contents to be sifted later, doing everything delicately so that every bit of human existence in the room could be carefully examined later. The space from which Gideon Giles ruled his domain was about 10 by 10. Posters advocating his favorite causes filled the walls. A bulletin board to the right of the door covered the entire wall, floor to ceiling. It contained business cards, a massive 8.5 by 11 multi-hued circulars, and press releases announcing specific dates and times for meetings of the groups advertised around the room. Next to a notice for the Flat Earth Society was a flyer giving the time for a meeting of ACTA. Turner waited for the technical people to finish. The medical examiner came in 15 minutes after the crime lab. People started. He scrutinized the body. He spoke as he worked the room at large. "Wasn't stabbed or shot." A gray-haired man whom Turner didn't like, the medical examiner, mumbled to himself as he unbuttoned, prodded, and pushed at the body. He examined the neck carefully. "Wasn't strangled." Turner resisted the impulse to give his opinion of what killed Giles. He knew from experience that if he spoke, he'd get an officious lecture. The ME mumbled. "Probably poison." Turner had seen enough murders to have made this guess 45 minutes ago. But he kept quiet. The ME had to earn his paycheck, too. Turner had examined the small refrigerator in the corner of the room nearest the window. He used his pin wedged around the handle to open the door. Inside, he'd found 6 bottles. 3 were filled with health food juices, with safety seals intact. The other 3 had no labels and no safety seals. Green liquid with orange flecks in it filled 2 of these to the brim. One was half full. He called Sam Franklin over. With exquisite care, the 2 of them pulled the half-full bottle out of the refrigerator and removed its cap. "Oh, smells vile," Franklin said. "Better take special care of everything in the refrigerator," Turner said. Franklin agreed. "You see the juicer on the table by the door?" "Take it with you," Turner said. Turner followed the medical examiner out of the room. Fenwick stood at the open doorway talking to the commander of Area 10. He was a tall black man with snow-white hair. The commander hadn't tried to enter the room, and Turner knew he wouldn't. He saw the other brass out in the hallway. Fenwick caught Turner's look. "I was lucky to keep them out. I almost had to tackle the guy from the superintendent's office." "Do it if you have to," the commander said. "This is going to be tough enough as it is. What have you got?" "ME said poison," Turner said. "I agree. No food and evidence. But we've got a cup on the desk with residue in it. Could have come from the juice container in the refrigerator. Probably in the drink. We've got to figure out how the killer put it there. He or she had to risk being recognized if it was administered here. Depends on the kind of poison." "Could it have been suicide?" the commander asked. "Possible," Turner said, "but I haven't seen a note. We'll be checking it." "Anything else yet?" the commander asked. "Just starting to question the locals. Going to take a while," Turner told him. "Lots of press and public attention on this one," the commander said. "Usual with this kind of thing," Turner said. The commander sighed. "More than usual. I can't believe how many calls I've gotten from aldermen worried about their sacred persons." He rubbed a hand across his face. I'll try to keep the pressure off you guys as best I can, but it would sure as hell help if you came up with a killer as soon as possible. He didn't comment further on their investigation or try to make suggestions. He trusted Turner and Fenwick to do what was right. They had a 95% conviction rate. They knew how to make an arrest and knew what to do to make it stick. The commander wished them luck and strolled over to the cops from downtown. Fenwick and Turner returned to the outer office. Turner examined the massive oak desk itself, then shifted carefully through the papers on top. No suicide note. An appointment calendar lay on the upper right-hand corner of the desk. Giles had had a university committee meeting later that day, but nothing else. With the tip of his pen, Turner turned over the leaf to Monday. The previous evening, Giles had met with a group called Friends of the Ferd and Finney. Turner checked the past weeks and the next few. He wrote down the names of all the groups and people. The most appointments he'd had in a day was 6. A few days had nothing. He found several phone messages and took down the names and numbers on them. Sam Franklin brought in 2 mugs encased in large plastic bags. Turner glanced in both of them. "These are all we found in the room," Franklin said. He pointed to a dark blue one. "I found this one on the floor behind the desk. We'll find traces on the inside. Got to be poison in it." "That's my guess," Turner said. He got Sanchez to bring in each of the witnesses from the hall one by one. They started with the person who sounded the alarm. They talked in the outer office. The witness in one of the chairs. Fenwick leaning on the table in the back. Turner sitting on the edge of the desk. Clark Burke was a student at the university. 5'6", maybe all of 120 pounds. Blonde hair, standing out straight from the top of his head on an inch. Cut short on the sides, he wore a button-down white shirt, black Z, Cavalrecci pants, with the label at the zipper, and black athletic shoes. Turner noted Burke's fingertips were red, and the nails chewed down. Burke spoke in a surprisingly deep and mellow voice. Most of the time his hands hung nearly motionless on the chair arms, except for occasional forays to his mouth, where a fingernail got chewed. They found out he was a student temp who substituted for different departments when secretaries called in sick or were out on vacation. He answered phones, took messages, and did some typing. He was a sophomore at the university, majoring in English. Turner observed that Burke's eyes made surreptitious glances at Turner's crotch. Turner asked, "Could you tell us what happened?" "I'm a little shook up. I don't know what you want me to say." Burke chewed on a nail. "Start at the beginning," Turner suggested. "Tell us what you did today." "I've worked in this department a couple times before. Never for Mr. Giles. Until this week. His regular secretary's on vacation. The head of the department, Mr. Sorensen, always asks for me when one of the secretaries is out. I know most of the members of the department." "How well did you know Mr. Giles?" Turner asked. "A little. I knew who he was by sight." "Did someone really poison him?" Fenwick asked. "How did you know he was poisoned?" "That's what people in the hall said. I thought he was having a heart attack." "How was he to work for the past 2 days?" Turner asked. "Yesterday morning, Monday. I only saw him for a few minutes. He gave me a bunch of stuff to type. This morning he came in and asked how I was doing on the typing. I still had 10 pages to do. He didn't say much else." "It would help if you could give us as many details about today as possible," Turner said. "Anything you could remember might be important." Burke chewed on a nail for a minute, then noticed he was doing it. "Nervous habit," he muttered. He held one hand with the other in his lap. He said, "I got here at 9. That's the usual starting time. For the first couple hours, I was here by myself. I just answered the phone and typed." "How many calls were there?" Fenwick asked. "Only a few. I don't remember the messages. I put them on his desk." "Did people from other offices come in?" Burke thought. "A few people put their heads in the door and asked for Gwendolyn, the regular secretary, but nobody came in for Giles. He came in about 11:30. I told him about the messages. He gave me a couple more things to type. I could only do 50 words a minute, so it takes me quite a while to get anything done. The biggest thing was a manuscript for an article. What was the manuscript about? Fenwick asked. Mythos in Chaucer's Troilus. A post-structural analysis. What the hell does that mean? Fenwick asked. Burke shrugged. Did you see him after he gave you the work? Burke said. He came out once near noon and told me I could go to lunch and not worry about how long I took. He did the same thing yesterday. I think he was trying to be nice. I took an hour. We usually take only half that. Turner noted Burke's demeanor and mannerisms while the 19-year-old talked. Burke looked him in the eye when he answered. He seemed to be thinking carefully about his answers rather than cautiously. Burke told them that no one came in to see Giles after the professor showed up for work. You leave any time during the morning? Turner asked. Just for a break, around 10. I was gone maybe 15 minutes. Then a few minutes after Giles got here, I went down to go to the John. How long were you gone then? Turner asked. Maybe 5 minutes. I had to use the washroom on the second floor. I couldn't find the key to the one on this floor. Turner asked. What happened when you got back from lunch? I finished typing some letters and took them into him. What were they about? Turner asked. Mostly to magazines about articles he planned to write. I think he was a little surprised to see me. Did you notice what he was drinking? Turner asked. I saw his mug. I don't know what was in it. Don't know where he got it. Why do you think he was surprised that you came back? Turner asked. Some of the temps try to take advantage. Most of them. If they got told to take as long as they want, they take advantage and not show up for a couple hours. If the temp agency caught them, they could be in trouble. I don't want to risk losing this job. How did he seem when you talked to him? Fenwick asked. Well, I can't compare it to how he was normally, because I'd never talked to him until this week, but he seemed kind of rattled and busy. Turner watched the blue eyes searching his. He saw that Burke rubbed his hands on his pants legs, probably sweating. Did Burke realize he was a suspect in a murder case? Nervous at being questioned by the police, probably for the first time in his life. Certainly scared at what had happened. What made you think he was rattled and busy? Fenwick asked. Well, he was polite mostly, but gruff, like, thank you, and get out, I'm busy. We temps are used to that. Most people think we're dirt, but it's a good way to make money to get through college. Did anyone come in after you left? Turner asked. Nope. Then what happened? Fenwick asked. Well, I sat down here at the computer. I was several pages into a manuscript, the Chaucer article, when I heard a thump from the room next door. I didn't pay much attention, but then I heard horrible gasping and more thumps. Burke stood up, jammed his hands in his pants pockets, and walked to the doorway to the hall. He glanced left and right, then turned back to the two cops, crossing his arms and leaning a shoulder against the door jamb. He spoke softly, but without hesitation. I rushed into the room. I saw him on the floor. I ran to him. He gasped a few more times. I ran to the drinking fountain down the hall to get him some water. I ran back in. He was still breathing. I shouted for help. He started to throw up and have some sort of convulsions. It was awful. He drew several deep breaths. People came running. I'm not sure who or how many. I was pretty shook up. I do remember dialing 911. Burke slowly walked back to the chair and sat down gingerly. He gulped. I've never watched somebody die. His eyes found Turner's. The cop returned the gaze, saw misty-eyed confusion and something else in the lingering look he wasn't sure of. Burke couldn't tell them anymore. They'd check into his background and story later. At this moment, two paramedics carried the body bag out. Turner watched Burke turn stark white. Turner told the kid he could go. Burke, his color still bad, managed to gasp. "Are my parents going to find out about this?" Turner said. "At the moment, we don't plan on calling them." "Are they a problem? Should we call them?" "My parents are going to be worried," he said. "My dad especially. Didn't want me to go to Chicago." "How's that?" Turner asked. "I'm from Chatsworth, Iowa, a town near the left end of nowhere. They still think the people in Chicago carry machine guns and shoot each other like in Prohibition times. I was glad to get away." "Trouble at home?" Turner asked. "Don't get me wrong," Burke said. "I love my mom and dad. It's just they aren't used to the big city. I've never been able to go here. If I hadn't got a big scholarship, I'd still have to work. Farming is tough in the part of Iowa I'm from. If they hear I'm involved in a murder, they could get real upset. I don't want to go back." Turner tried to be reassuring while making no commitments about who he would or wouldn't tell. The next person to be interviewed was Atherton Sorensen, head of the English department. Sorensen had a fringe of white hair around a bald scalp. He wore a bandoline shirt on a sloped-shouldered frame and khaki pants with a belt pulled to the last loop on a slightly thickened waist. He stepped a foot inside the door and stopped. Sorensen spoke in a mellifluous baritone. With his hands, he made wide, solemn gestures. Turner could see him pontificating in front of groups of graduate students, staring back with glazed expressions. Sorensen didn't wait to be asked a question, but began orating at them unbidden. "Politics. This is the result of getting involved in the muck. I told Giles again and again it was not seemly for him to be involved with that filth. I wanted him to take a leave of absence, and then when he won that battle, I wanted him to quit. But the higher-ups in the university wouldn't listen. They should have." Turner could easily imagine the man at a later, more seemly time, trying to score points with his peers about how right he'd been about that Gideon Giles. Fenwick said, "Tell us where you were from noon to 1:30 today?" Sorensen looked startled at Fenwick's tone. Turner had worked with his partner long enough to distinguish between his normal abruptness and his genuine dislike for someone. This was the later. Turner didn't care for Sorensen either, but he didn't want to turn off these people now. But he also didn't mind Fenwick's gruffness. It might shake something loose from a guilty person. "We need everyone's movements on this floor," Turner said. "Someone might have seen the killer." Sorensen took this a little better. He swept to the chair and settled his expansive rear end onto its wood. He placed a finger against the right side of his head and stared at the ceiling. He asked, "I lunched at the Quadriga Club, as I always do. I remember today's discussion was about the relation between sunlight on hawthorn leaves in Proust and darkness and light in Timon of Athens. I always try to have a topic for my colleagues to discuss at the table." He lowered his head to look at them. "I don't suppose you read Proust?" Fenwick growled. Sorensen raised an eyebrow at him. Turner asked, "Who'd you have lunch with?" "A young instructor, James Everly, the head of the philosophy department, Bertram Elston, and one or two visitors from the Sorbonne. I don't remember their names. They aren't important. Are they?" "Was Giles there?" "No, he didn't join us today." "Did he usually?" Turner asked. "Not often. I'd say a quarter of the time. When he became alderman, he took part in far fewer activities connected to the university." "What time did you finish?" Turner asked. "Around 1. I returned to my office and stayed there the whole time. You can ask my secretary. She'll vouch for me." Turner asked about relationships between faculty members. "You mean, did he have any enemies?" Sorensen asked. "Anything you can tell us about how he got along with his colleagues?" Sorensen settled himself back in the chair this time, leaning a finger of his left hand against his head and staring at the ceiling. "Well, he didn't really get along with us at all. Not in the sense that he had enemies, but he was above us all. He had that more committed than thou attitude, which I thought disappeared with the 60s. You've seen the posters in his office. He didn't meet a cause he didn't embrace. Sorensen explained that in terms of departmental politics, Giles was not an important factor, and that Giles stayed on at the university so he'd have a political base. It looked good on his credentials, a legitimate profession as opposed to alderman in the city. Turner thought Sorensen made the job of alderman sound worse than that of a rat collector. Did he seem depressed to you lately? Turner asked. You mean, was he suicidal? Definitely not. Man had an ego to match Lear in Act 1. They asked about Giles' background. He'd had excellent credentials, graduated from the university, did postgraduate work there and at Stanford. He'd become a full professor the year before he'd branched out into politics. This was about 10 years ago. Did he always do causes? Turner asked. No. When he got here, he was quiet. The subservient young man, minded his manners, made a good impression on everyone. Careful in his opinions on academic matters. He rarely took a chance in the research he published, but it was always solidly reasoned. Giles had gotten heavily into causes the year after he got tenure. He'd become quite obnoxious, insisting the department take absurd positions. He wanted to declare the department a nuclear-free zone. I thought he might be losing his mind. Nobody was going to build a nuclear power plant on this university campus. Some professors become eccentric in their old age, but Giles went balmy on us early. Could you get rid of him? Fenwick asked. Sorensen gaped at him, pointed a finger, breathed deeply, and said, Tenure laws are inviolate. I'm sure you're not suggesting we make the life of a professor subject to the whims of fortune. Fenwick growled. No enemies? None, Sorensen said quickly. Turner thought His Majesty might be a little intimidated by Fenwick, and he enjoyed watching it, but they still had to get any information out of him they could. Do you know if Giles had any habits about what he drank or ate here at the university? Turner asked. I haven't the faintest notion, Sorensen said. Did you see anybody or anything unusual at any time today? Any strangers walking through the building? Turner asked. Sorensen thought a moment, then shook his head no. Notice any change in Giles lately? Unusually nervous or tense? Another elegant shake of the head. Did he have a habit of drinking one particular thing in his office every day? Turner asked. You can ask his secretary Gwendolyn when she returns from vacation. Now that I think about it, I vaguely recall he tried to eat healthy things, perhaps drank carrot juice and such nonsense. They let him go. Fenwick said, Stupor over it. Intellectual. Bet he doesn't know shit about the real world. Turner heard shouting coming from the hallway outside. I'll check it out, Fenwick said. Moments later, the bulky cop flew backwards through the doorway, landing with his back against a poster that ripped and fell off the wall. Turner jumped up. A tall black woman stood in the doorway. She sneered at Fenwick, then stepped aside. A pale woman staggered into the room. She wore a velvet dress, gold-flecked tulle scarf, and clutched Alon MacLeay sunglasses in one hand. Where is he? She gasped. Sanchez appeared at the door. Sorry, Paul. They busted past us. Want me to get rid of them? I'll do it, Fenwick marched order. Turner held up a hand. Who are you? The starkly pale woman said. I'm Laura Gideon Giles. She pointed to the black woman. Lilac called me at work. She said something terrible had happened. She told me my husband is... Laura Giles took a deep breath and drew herself up very straight. Her violet eyes searched theirs. For several moments she said, I think I would like to sit down. Turner hated dealing with the families of the victims, especially if he was the one who had to break the news. He'd been spared that difficulty this time. They helped Laura Giles to a chair. Dry-eyed and dazed, she whispered, What happened? Turner told her as much as they knew. After he finished, she muttered, "I don't believe it. This morning we talked about remodeling our cottage in Michigan. It was one of his favorite places, and we just decided to fix it up. I can't believe we'll never... I don't know what to do. We know this is a difficult time, Mrs. Giles, but if you could answer a few questions, it might help us find your husband's killer." "Murdered," she said. She rummaged in her purse and pulled out a pack of Virginia Slims and some matches. Fenwick gave her a styrofoam cup with a layer of coffee in the bottom to use as an ashtray. "Can we get you something?" Turner asked. She blew smoke out through her nostrils. "A cup of tea, please." Lilac left, returned a few minutes later with a steaming cup. She remained standing in the doorway. Laura Giles took a large gulp of the hot liquid, shut her eyes, and breathed the vapors. She put the cup down, took another long drag on her cigarette, missed the ashtray with a flick of ash, and turned to stare at Turner. "A few questions, please, Mrs. Giles," Turner said. Her body shook for several moments. She stabbed the cigarette into the cup. Turner heard it sizzle. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, looked up and said, "I'll help any way I can to find his murderer." Turner asked for background on Giles' life. Who might have grudges from years ago, who might not like him now. Mrs. Giles explained that she and her husband had met in graduate school at Stanford University. She majored in business law and he in English and political science. They dated for 3 years during graduate school, then moved together to Southern California, while Gideon worked on his PhD in English. She attended USC for her MBA. "We were so broke those years. We had a million fights about money. We threatened to call it quits. Nearly every week. He just had no head for money. Give him a credit card and he went nuts. I had to take them all away." "But you got married eventually," Turner said. "We went into therapy for a year together and resolved our differences. We always loved each other. We just had a lot of growing up to do." After receiving their degrees, they'd worked together for several years on projects to help the homeless in Southern California. "Those were the happiest times of our lives. We felt committed. We knew our work was paying off. We could see results. Shelters built, man and woman placed in homes. She'd gotten a business offer from an old college friend. They'd moved to Chicago. Gideon continued his work with the homeless. Laura Giles prospered in business. Gideon eventually landed the job at the University of Chicago. As far as she knew, he had no enemies from before the time she met him. After he got the job at the university, we moved to Hyde Park. He got involved in the community, moved up the ranks in the department. People in higher education have all kinds of petty quarrels. Who doesn't at work? And some of them became jealous when the community began pushing him for alderman. Who was jealous? Turner asked. Sorensen, the head of the department, for one. I don't really remember the names now. She said that Giles had made enemies as his notoriety grew and his ability to grab the attention of reporters expanded. People didn't like it that this articulate good man could promote programs and causes so well, Fenwick said. I thought not one of his bills ever got passed in the city council. There are other ways to exercise influence, she says. Just being an alderman in this city gives you some clout. We'd been in enough causes over the years to know that you don't always succeed by just getting votes. Any political enemies? Turner asked. Not really. He fought with people, but he was always professional about it. They understood each other. The only one who held a grudge of any kind was the man he replaced as ward committeeman. Who was that? Turner asked. Oh, that awful Mike McGee. Turner didn't recognize the name. Tell me about him. McGee had this more committed-than-thou attitude. He'd supported lots of causes, but never seemed to get anything accomplished for any of them. His reform candidates always seemed to lose. My husband found out he'd been robbing the organizations that trusted him, siphoning off funds. What happened? Turner asked. Gideon talked to him privately, offered him a deal that if he quit, he wouldn't report him. McGee refused, so my husband defeated him in the election. They'd have to interview McGee. How about neighbors? Turner asked. Any problems there? No. We had little contact with them. Our lives were too busy. Still, they'd have to visit the neighbors. Did he eat or drink or anything specific every day? A habit people might have been aware of? Turner asked. We usually had coffee together at home in the morning. I know he was into health foods. He brought his own vegetables and juices for his own concoctions. He never made them at home. Why is that important? We think something he drank was poisoned, Turner said. Oh. She lit another cigarette and smoked in silence, staring at the walls. A few tears escaped from the corners of her eyes. She fished a lace handkerchief out of her purse and dabbed her eyes, but the tears became a flow. She buried her face in the hanky. The African-American woman put her arms around her. Laura Giles crumbled into the embrace and cried softly. A few minutes later, the two women left, leaning heavily on each other. Turner's memory of the night his wife died was dim. He remembered being numb, knew he cried in his best friend's arms. Who was the African-American woman? Turner asked Sanchez. One of the members of the department, Lilac Ostergaard, Sanchez said. Folks out here say she's Mrs. Giles' best friend. They spent the next hour interviewing 7 other people. Those who'd rushed in to help, others in the department. Mostly they confirmed what they'd learned already. All of them showed varying degrees of being upset at the loss of a co-worker. None of them had seen any strangers or anyone suspicious lurking in the halls. Turner felt a cop's twinge of suspicion about 2 of the faculty members. Sure they weren't telling the truth, and his instinct told him to check them out. Most of the time, believing in instinct wasn't going to get him far in court, but he trusted it enough to follow it up. The first was Darcy Worthington, a blonde-haired woman in his late 40s, about the same age as Giles. He spoke with a New England accent. In response to their questioning, he told them that years ago he and Giles had been best friends. We started the same year, Worthington said. We got together with our wives often, but I want to make sure I tell you before the gossips around here do. We had a falling out over his political activities. You disagree with him philosophically? Turner asked. Not too much. No, we fought because I discovered he was the most ruthlessly ambitious person I'd ever met. I didn't see that side of him until he decided to run for office. Winning consumed him. He shook his head. I regretted the loss of the friendship. We never really quarreled openly. I just let the friendship drift and stopped responding to him. When he left, Turner said, I want to check him out more. Fenwick said, I wouldn't trust him as far as I could pound his butt into the pavement. The other suspicious person was Otto Kemp. Otto was a roly-poly man, Turner guessed to be in his mid-40s. He mopped his forehead with an enormous starched white handkerchief after every other sentence. I heard the cries for help, he said. I rushed over. My office is across the hall. It was a mad whirl of people. I was frightened, but I took CPR many years ago, before it became fashionable. I tried to revive him. People were shouting and screaming. Every time someone yelled, he spasmed. Kemp puffed breaths out for several minutes. After a thorough face wipe, he continued, He died in my arms. It was awful. It was ghastly. I never want to go through something like that again. They let him compose himself for several minutes. They asked him a few more questions, like everyone else. He hadn't seen any strangers, nor had he seen Giles. How do you get along with people in the department? Turner asked. We're academics, dedicated to research. We try to care about ideas, not personalities. I like to think I did that most of the time. People might tell you that Giles and I took opposite sides on esoteric academic issues. Our Chaucer essays were wonders to behold. I thought of it as a friendly rivalry of a good sort. Kemp left a few minutes later. Him I don't like, Fenwick said. Stupid hanky. They walked back to the inner office to begin checking through all the papers. Turner tried to avoid getting the remnants of fingerprint powder all over his clothes. "Killer must have had a hell of a nerve," Fenwick said. "Might have been recognized coming in here. Could have been surprised by Burke coming back early. Or the person could have come in days before," Turner said. "Placed the poison in the juice and waited for him to drink it. But you're right. He or she had to risk being recognized." They spent the next 2 hours going through every piece of paper in Gideon Giles' office. They confirmed Burke's story about messages. They found countless letters from causes asking for support. They switched on the computer and ran through 7 of the 28 computer disks. Near 5 o'clock, Sanchez stuck his head in. The beat cop said, "I got 2 people out here. One says he's from the University Press office, and the other claims she's a representative of the university administration." Turner and Fenwick put up with a mild dose of administrative. "Let's involve the university in as little scandal as possible." Turner let them indulge in their bureaucratic skittishness and then ushered them out the door. "We're not going to finish this anytime soon," Fenwick said, after he returned from hustling them out of the office. "Let's leave our guard and get something to eat." They walked over to Hutchinson Commons and grabbed a couple of sandwiches and some coffee and sat in the dark wood-paneled dining hall. Fenwick gazed at the portrait staring down at them and asked, "Who are all the farts?" Turner shrugged. He knew Fenwick rarely expected answers to impossible questions. At the far end of the dining hall, Turner noticed Clark Burke sitting with a handsome young man who had a large green book bag on the table next to him. He watched curiously as the two engaged in intent conversation. Turner nudged Fenwick and pointed. The 2 cops watched the students for a few minutes. "I think the kid's gay," Fenwick said. "I agree," Turner replied. "But I don't think that little snippet of information is going to get us any closer to who killed Gideon Giles." Turner wanted to talk to some of the people in Giles' Fifth Ward organization. He suggested they leave the papers in Giles' office until later. They'd gone over most of the important ones. "I want to try and see some of these campaign people today," Turner said. He'd taken a blank piece of the campaign stationery with the office address on it. They drove to 57th in Dorchester. A lone figure stared out the window. When they walked into the headquarters, the office was one of several in a 1-story building on the north side of the street. The decorations on the walls repeated the scheme in Giles's office. Poster after poster of causes lined every surface. Turner saw one of Che Guevara tucked in a corner of a real wall. The man staring out the window appeared to be in his mid-30s. He didn't acknowledge their presence until they stood directly in front of him. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, had short-cropped hair, and wore a white t-shirt with the words, "You gotta believe," in faded blue letters across the chest. He let his eyes rove to the 2 of them and said, "Everybody's gone. The alderman's dead." They showed their stars and identified themselves. The man blinked and sighed. He told them his name was Frank Riken. "Where'd everybody go?" Fenwick asked. "Press conference." Riken leaned back in the chair. "That's what this office specialized in, press conferences. We lived to get them on TV. I got the numbers of all the important television and radio contacts memorized. We know media and manipulated them. First name basis with all the local reporters in the city. And all we got is murder. That's how it's always been. If you get an effective liberal, kill him." Fenwick asked, "You think a conservative killed him?" "The right wing in this country has destroyed every liberal cause with vicious lies, distortions, every dirty trick in the book. They'd easily resort to murder. There's lots of right-wing crazies out there." "What were you in the organization?" Fenwick asked. "Campaign chairperson. Specialized in press relations. Not the spokesperson. We had somebody in a gray suit and tie to make the announcements to the press. People like to see respectable spokespersons. I controlled contacts. How come you're here if there's a press conference somewhere else? What's the point? The cause is lost. It always is, Turner asked. Did he get any specific threats lately? Anybody he annoyed more than anyone else? The mayor of the city of Chicago and the other 49 aldermen, they all hated him. Somebody specific. Did he mention any new problems? Something that might have come up recently? Not to me. And he'd have told me. We were close. They asked him how the alderman's organization functioned. Riken said Giles very much believed in lack of structure. If somebody came in and they had a cause, they worked on it. We had two people who did nothing but work on the problems in Central America. Isn't that kind of unusual project for a Chicago alderman? Fenwick asked. All causes were welcome here. Gideon Giles truly believed in giving his all to the helpless, the hopeless, and the homeless. Fenwick said, We need to seal the office. Examine the files. Riken said, I can authorize that. I have access to everything in the office. Turner said, Could you show us around, explain what we're looking at? I'm sure you want to help us find who killed him. You never know what might be significant. Riken led them into an inner office. It was a shabby duplicate of the professor's office. More posters for more causes filling the walls. Pamphlets stacked on tables, crammed against each wall. A desk strewn with paraphernalia set in the middle of the room. Riken explained the system, then excused himself. And the cops got to work. Half an hour later, Fenwick walked out to see about some coffee. He stuck his head back in the office. That Riken guy's gone. Turner joined him in the outer office. I don't like that, Turner said. He got spooked and ran, Fenwick said. Turner shrugged. We can find him later. Why not get a couple beat cops over here and seal the place off? We should have done that earlier. They spent another hour going through the office, but found nothing that might have indicated a murderer. They ducked under the do not cross police ribbon and were saying goodnight to the beat cop on duty when a woman in her 50s approached them. She wore a gray skirt and blue sweater. Her gray flecked hair hung to her shoulders. She saw them, the police bearer, and said, I'm Mabel Ashcroft, the alderman's chief assistant, and you are? Turner and Fenwick identified themselves. Ashcroft said, Are we going to be able to get our personal items from inside? Turner watched her carefully in the late spring afternoon. The air was cool, a light breeze blew off the lake. Pathetic dribs of water leaked from the remnants of a few snowdrifts. Ashcroft had red-rimmed eyes and a worried expression. Turner said, Why don't we go inside and talk? They sat near the front window at a table crammed with papers, boxes, and equipment. Fenwick shoved several phones and piles of papers out of the way. Turner asked, Who's Frank Riken? Ashcroft drew her hand to her throat. Her eyes widened. Was he here? He was the only one here when we arrived, Turner said. He's not supposed to be here. He got fired last week. She told them about the internal bickering that went on in the ward office. One faction after another pushed one cause after the other. Giles supported all of them, but each faction lobbied for more and more of his time. A tear rolled down her cheek. He genuinely tried to help people. He was always torn, trying to do so much. He always said there wasn't enough time to help all those who needed it. Why was Riken fired? Turner asked. Frank always tried too hard. His cause was saving the wetlands. Not a big issue in this ward. He got furious if we didn't care as much as he wanted us to. Gideon helped as much as he could, but Frank was never satisfied. The alderman had a huge meeting every Saturday with representatives of all the different causes, trying to get them to work together or form coalitions. Frank took up more and more time at the meetings. He became more and more strident. Do all the people from the causes get jobs in the ward office? Turner asked. No, it was the other way around. If you worked for the alderman, you were encouraged to get involved in a cause. Did Graham ever fight with Giles? Publicly? Turner asked. At the last meeting, he threatened all of us, told us we'd be sorry for not listening to him. Maybe this is what he meant. She retrieved Riken's address for them. They asked about other possible conflicts. Ashcroft said each cause had its advocates, but they all wanted something from the alderman. He could do them good. They wouldn't want to hurt him. How about personality conflicts in the office? Turner asked. She shook her head. Everybody was too busy. Working here was like the old days in the 60s. We all cared. Dedicated people who wanted to make the world a better place to be. She plucked a Kleenex from a box on the windowsill and dabbed at her eyes. We accomplished a lot, and Gideon Giles was the reason. The causes will miss him, but I'll miss him more. He was a good, kind man. So much compassion. Can you tell us anything about his home life? Turner asked. His wife has a career of her own. She's a commodities trader down on LaSalle Street. High-powered financial position. I've met her numerous times. Seemed to love Gideon. Was always supportive of his causes and his work as he was of hers. Kids? Fenwick asked. No children. They had their causes. They asked about the movements of the people in the office between noon and 1:30. She drummed her fingers on the tabletop and thought. Finally, she said, on weekdays, it's pretty slow here. Weekends, the place hums. Today, we just had the regulars. Me, Audrey, the receptionist, and Hank, the legislative assistant. Where were they, around noon? Fenwick asked. We locked up the office and scattered. I had errands to run. I'm not sure where Audrey and Hank went. It's Wednesday, so Hank probably went to pick up the weekly printing. Oh, weekly printing? Fenwick asked. She pointed to the mounds of brochures around the room. We do a large volume of business with several local printers. Wednesday is the normal pickup day. She gave them Audrey and Hank's full names and addresses. Fenwick rummaged through the campaign literature while Turner talked to two uniformed cops and Ashcroft about securing the office for the night. Turner finished and walked over to Fenwick. His partner held up two fistfuls of brochures. Look at these, he said. Got to be hundreds of them. Turner glanced at them. Bring one of each along, he said. We can go over them later. He doubted if the printed ramblings would do anything but waste time. They left the campaign office at 7 and returned to Area 10 headquarters. At their desk, they pulled out blank forms. Case report, major crime, worksheet, daily major incident log, supplementary report. They began the tedious process of documenting everything they'd done that day. The district commander stopped by at 9:30. He asked them how it was going. They told him. The commander shook his head. I've got to have results on this. Get those interviews done on the campaign people and the family first thing tomorrow. The pressure is more pervasive than anything I've ever seen. I've got calls from the superintendent, a number of aldermen, every other two-bit politician in the city. That doesn't count the press. Individually, they're ignorable, but collectively, it's tougher to stand up to them. This case is tough. One of the biggest murders in years in this town, he sighed. Do what you can, but don't stay here forever tonight. You've got lives to live. Fenwick and Turner left at midnight, having put a decent-sized dent in the paperwork, but with a great deal left to do. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.